Welcome to the MacMillan Report. I'm Marilyn Wilkes, your host, and our guest is Margaret Peters, an assistant professor of political science at Yale University. Her research focuses broadly on international political economy with a special focus on the politics of migration. Her work has appeared in International Organization, World Politics, and International Interactions. She teaches classes on international political economy and migration. Today we talk with Professor Peters about her recent World Politics article entitled Open Trade, Closed Borders, Immigration in the Era of Globalization. Welcome, Professor Peters.
Thank you so much for having me.
Let's begin with an overview of your article. Tell us about it.
Right, so this article looks at immigration policy in many different countries over the last 200 years, so going back into the 19th century. And what we see during that time period is we see that the 19th century was a period of a fair amount of openness towards immigration. That's when you think about, you know, all those people coming from Europe over to the United States or moving to other parts of the New World. And there was also a fair amount of openness within Europe itself. What we see today, as you can see in like the recent migrant crisis in Europe and other places, is a lot more restrictions on migration than there were in the past. So this article looks at, you know, why that is and examines this by contrasting it to trade policy, whereby we see sort of the opposite in trade policy. You know, trade is very open today, but in the past it was much more restricted.
I see, okay. And what led you to write the article?
I actually started on this project back in graduate school when I was a little second-year graduate student. And I just was looking at immigration policies of interest because it was something that was fairly understudied in political science at the time, and found this sort of interesting correlation that countries that had more restricted trade policies seem to have more open immigration policy and vice versa. So countries that had more open trade policies seem to have more restricted immigration policy. And I sort of started to wonder why this was the case, and was there a relationship between the two?
Okay, and let's talk about the research and how you did your methodology, and it's kind of unique where you've used data that really hasn't been tapped before.
Correct. So what I did for the project, because there wasn't really any data on immigration policies over that long of a time period, or really that was publicly available to use, I created my own indice of immigration policy for these 19 different countries. So they include countries in the New World, so US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, that we typically think about when we think about immigration. It also includes countries in Europe, which are thought to be sort of more newer countries of immigration. And then some of these countries that in the global south that get a lot of immigration, like the countries in the Persian Gulf, so Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, and places like Singapore. So what I did is I collected a huge amount of data over many years, looking at the laws that these countries had passed on immigration. And then what I did with some graduate assistants and undergraduate assistant researchers, I then coded this data in a bunch of different ways, thinking about how do we think about immigration policy, and coded it.
Wow, it sounds like a huge undertaking, actually.
It was.
Yeah. So why is it important to look at immigration in an era of globalization?
Well, I think, you know, we're in an era of globalization now, and it's also just this really interesting question. When we think about globalization, we think about the amount of openness there is towards trade, towards the flow of capital. And then when we look at migration, there's many more restrictions on it than there is on these other flows. And so if we think about, you know, globalizing the world and integrating the world and, you know, having this one large world economy, it's sort of interesting that we don't allow the same flows of people that we do of goods or of money.
So has immigration and trade policy been used over time?
Yeah, so that's what I find in the article, is that when trade is relatively more restricted, you get more open immigration policy, and vice versa. So the reason I think that this is going on is it's going through the actions of firms. So when trade is relatively restricted, firms basically don't find as much competition from overseas because they have trade barriers that help them produce at home. In a lot of the countries that I look at that are targets of immigration, this means that these industries like textiles or toys or other low-skill industries expand, And so firms then lobby for more workers because they're expanding industries, there's not enough labor, and so they lobby the government for greater numbers of workers and for greater immigration. Once trade opens, a lot of those low-skill firms close. So we've seen this, here in, say, the textile sector here in the United States. We don't really, cheap T-shirts, we get them from China now versus once upon a time they were manufactured here in the United States. And as that happens, as those firms close, they no longer need the same number of workers, and so they're not even, some of those firms aren't even here to lobby for open immigration any longer, and other firms can use the workers that those companies laid off. And so you just see many fewer low-skill jobs in the country, many fewer firms that use that kind of labor, and because of that, they just don't exist to lobby on immigration any longer, which allows policymakers who are facing a lot of constraints on immigration, face a lot of groups that don't really like immigration, to restrict it to make those groups happy without making business interests relatively unhappy.
So how does trade policy actually affect immigration policy then?
So it's through this firm lobbying is what I argue, is that because you see the shrinking of the low-skill, labor-intensive sectors in these countries. So again, if you think about sectors that used to use a lot of immigrant labor here in the United States, like since we're not far from the main old textile mills in Lowell, Massachusetts, and other places like that that used a huge amount of immigrant labor in the 19th century, when those industries are relatively protected, they then lobbied to help keep immigration open. Whereas once we saw greater globalization and greater openness to trade after World War II, and those tariff barriers came down, we've seen all those textile firms move out of the United States, move to China, move to Bangladesh, move to areas with cheaper labor. And because they don't exist any longer, they're not here to lobby the government for more open immigration.
Right, right. So what do you conclude in the article?
So I conclude a couple different things. First of all, it makes this, I make this argument that this could affect other areas besides immigration policy. So we could think about this in the same way with maybe environmental policy. So as globalization has allowed firms to move their production overseas or have been affected by other firms from other countries, we've seen the dirtier production move offshore. And so we have relatively cleaner firms here in the United States. And so that might mean that it's easier to pass environmental regulation here at home because the dirty firms have just moved overseas or don't exist. It does mean that maybe it's harder to pass global legislation on environmental policy, but it could affect environmental policy. Same thing with labor policy and other social policies. It also means that, unfortunately, for those who would like to do comprehensive immigration reform here in the United States, who would like to have more open immigration in Europe to maybe deal with the refugee crisis that they're having right now, that because you don't have the same level of business support for immigration, it means that you don't have the same coalition that you once did for open immigration.
Right.
And because we think businesses, we tend to think that they're relatively powerful and have ways, they lobby a lot, they provide a lot of campaign contributions and that sort of thing. It means that because there's not that powerful group, it means those forces of anti-immigration have relatively more power. So we've seen this most recently with the way comprehensive immigration reform has died again in the Senate and isn't even being taken up in the House of Representatives because there's no real pro-immigration lobby pushing for it, or not to the same extent, and so anti-immigration forces have relatively more power.
Right.
So it just means that we're probably going to see more restrictions on immigration rather than more openness.
Right, makes sense. Well, thanks very much for being here today and sharing some of your work.
Thank you for having me.
For more information about Professor Peters and her research, please visit our website at yale.edu MacMillan Report. Be sure to join us again for another episode of the MacMillan Report, made possible through funding from the Whitney and Betty MacMillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale.